The winter of Princess Solana. It was mid-morning when my younger sister, Talia, burst into my workroom, nearly tripping over her long skirts in her rush. She was out of breath, but her eyes sparkled with something fierce. I put down the dulling blade I'd been polishing and gave her a questioning look. "What is it this time?" She took a moment to collect herself, then said in a tone somewhere between disbelief and exhilaration, "The prince is dead." The prince?" I paused, blinking. "Seriously?" Talia nodded so hard her dark curls bounced. "He was killed in battle up by the Amber Bluffs. This is straight from the message runners." Her falcon regal swooped down to her shoulder, carrying a scroll as if to corroborate her story. Can you believe it? It took a few moments for her words to sink in. The prince, the cause of all the turmoil for 40 long years, the one who had kept the kingdom in a constant state of war, was dead. So the war is actually over? "It's really over," she confirmed, beaming. "Though technically there have been no active battles near our home in nearly a decade." The news was jarring. The endless tension of the war had felt as permanent as the seasons, something I'd long grown accustomed to, like a dull ache that never quite goes away. And now, it was just over. "So does everyone know?" I asked, the implications of the news slowly dawning on me. "Well," Talia coughed awkwardly. "Not exactly. Regal kind of intercepted the message. I mean, he thought it was for us." "That's illegal," I pointed out, though I couldn't help but smile at her sly grin. "It was bound to get around to us soon," she said, brushing it off. "But don't you realize what this means? That the war is over?" I ventured, uncertain of what else she could mean. "No, you're not seeing it. You'll have to," she lowered her voice. "Execute the old princess." I froze, the weight of her words hitting me with a strange finality. "Me?" She nodded solemnly. "They'll want her out of the way. You're the only one they'd trust for such a delicate task." It was 3 days before anyone officially confirmed the news to me. I acted surprised when my supervisor told me, feigning shock and respectfully bowing my head as the Count and his family declared themselves the new rulers of the kingdom. The court and the townspeople alike celebrated with feasts and music, marking the beginning of a new era. Late in the evening, the Count's daughter, Solana, now officially Princess Solana, approached me. "Leandra," she said with a tentative smile. "Princess Solana," I replied, curtsying with exaggerated formality, eliciting a giggle from her. That smile was familiar and warm, a rarity among the cold stares and tension that had defined the palace during the war years. But tonight, under the shimmering lights of the celebration, her laugh made the world feel lighter. "Enough with the formalities," she said, her eyes sparkling. Her black hair was escaping from an elaborate braid, tendrils framing her face in a way that felt almost familiar, like something I'd glimpsed before in a dream. She sighed. "It all feels strange now, doesn't it? I suppose. I mean, now you're a real princess after all," I replied, noting the proud, anxious look in her eyes. But her expression quickly turned serious. "Leandra, speaking of princesses," she hesitated. "There's still the matter of the prince's sister." Her words hung heavily between us. I could feel the weight of what she was asking, but wanted her to say it aloud. "Yes, they'll want you to," she trailed off, visibly struggling with the words, her eyes avoiding mine. "They'll want you to take care of it." "When?" "Tomorrow. At dawn." Her voice was barely a whisper, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of sorrow in her dark eyes. "Will you be there?" I asked, not entirely sure why I wanted her to be. The thought of executing the old princess was grim, and for a moment, I wanted Solana's comforting presence, if only to remind me that this was all necessary. Solana looked at me, her gaze steady, if a little distant. Would you like me to be? My heart ached with a silent, unspoken answer. No. I think it's best you don't. But I'll see you at breakfast afterward. She nodded, and I wanted to say something important, something about how I would do anything for her. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I merely repeated, of course. I'll see you tomorrow. The next morning, my brother Aaron roused me from my bed long before dawn. You're going to be late, he said, shaking me. They won't appreciate it. I groaned, pulling myself from sleep. I know. Dressing in the black cloak that marked me as the kingdom's executioner, I followed Aaron out into the early morning chill. As we walked, I asked him, Are you coming? He shrugged. Maybe, but only if it doesn't interfere with the work in the east fields. Jaden wants help turning the soil before it freezes solid. I raised an eyebrow. Why work so early in winter? Aaron shrugged. Someone has to keep things moving, even if it means before dawn. We parted ways, and I made my way through the winding paths toward the dungeons. As the cold bit into my fingers, I cursed the timing. Of all days, the first day of peace after a long, brutal war. And here I was, walking through frost and shadows to execute an old woman. The dungeon guard, a stoic young man named Edric, led me to a door I'd never opened before. When I inserted my master key, a voice from within said, It's unlocked. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside, the old princess sat calmly, her posture straight and dignified despite her years in confinement. Her plain gray hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and her piercing blue eyes focused on me with an unsettling clarity. You must be Leandra, she said. I inclined my head. Yes. And you're Princess Mirren. She nodded, smiling sadly. I've been expecting you. I was surprised by her composure. Most prisoners struggled, cried, begged. But she just sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Did they tell you I was coming? She shook her head, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. No. But when the guards stopped coming by, I knew. I knew the end had finally come. Are you ready? I asked, unsure what else to say. Mirren rose, stretching her stiff joints. As ready as anyone can be after waiting this long. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, like a lullaby. I was taken down here when I was just a child. My mother used to tell me stories about the gardens outside, how beautiful they were. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. Would you like to see them? Mirren's eyes shone with a quiet gratitude. I would love that. The two guards and I led her out of the dungeons, the cold morning air biting against our cheeks. We moved in silence toward the garden, where I was supposed to fulfill my duty. The frost-covered flowers glistened in the dawn light, their beauty stark against the impending act. Mirren knelt in the snow, reaching out to touch the frost-laden petals of a sleeping rose. Snow, she murmured, as if it were the most magical thing she had ever seen. I've never seen it before. I wanted to say something to comfort her, to tell her she didn't deserve this fate, but my duty loomed large, unyielding. Mirren looked up at me, her gaze calm, though filled with unshed tears. Don't wait, Leandra. Don't wait for life. Live for these moments. Her final words haunted me as I fulfilled my task. Afterward, her body was taken away, and I lingered, feeling a strange emptiness in the quiet garden. When I finally returned to the palace, I found Solana waiting for me, her dark eyes wide with worry. You're late, she murmured, her tone soft. I thought you'd join us for breakfast. I tried to answer, but my voice caught. The words of Princess Mirren echoed in my mind, urging me forward, telling me to live. For the first time, I looked at Solana, not just as the princess I served, but as someone I could choose to live for. someone I could choose to cherish. Do you want to go for a walk with me? I asked, surprised at my own daring. Solana's face broke into a smile that melted the frost from the air, her eyes sparkling with something unspoken, but unmistakably hopeful. I'd like that. And together, we stepped out into the winter garden, hand in hand, to finally see life's beauty for the first time. It was a chill mid-morning when my younger sister, Talia, burst into my workroom, nearly tripping over her skirts in her rush. I was polishing a dull blade, my thoughts heavy with worries over the growing frost that had come early to the northern forests. But her arrival shifted everything. "Leandra," she panted, her eyes wild with disbelief. "The prince is dead." The prince? Are you sure?" She nodded breathlessly. "In battle up near the Amber Bluffs. Regal intercepted a message from the northern scouts." Regal, her falcon, perched stoically on her shoulder, looking as smug as a bird possibly could with a small scroll still attached to his leg. "I had to tell you first," she continued, a mischievous grin breaking through her serious expression. "And Regal thought this message was meant for us." She gave her bird a little pat. "Talia," I whispered sharply, "you could be jailed for intercepting messages like this. That's no small offense." Her grin only widened. "Yes, but doesn't this change everything?" Slowly her words sank in. If Prince Arian was dead, then his relentless war, the war that had scarred every kingdom in the land for the last 4 decades, could finally be over. A strange, distant hope flared in my chest. "So," I whispered, daring to believe, "the war is over?" "Yes," she beamed, her laughter giddy. "It's really over, Leah. We can finally be free of all this fear." As her words filled the air, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The oppressive weight I'd carried for so long, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it began to lift like morning fog. Yet, that hope was tempered by a creeping apprehension. "What about the prince's sister?" I asked, the realization settling in as my excitement ebbed. "Princess Mirren," Talia's voice trailed off. She shared a knowing look with me. "They'll need her removed. She's the last of the line after all." It was 3 days before I officially received word. I had almost convinced myself that Regal's intercepted scroll was some kind of hoax or error. But my duties as the kingdom's master executioner didn't allow me the luxury of wishful thinking. The courier who brought the message looked as somber as I felt. I met the courier and a few soldiers in the Great Hall, where they handed me the sealed letter. It was brief and formal, yet the demand was clear. Princess Mirren was to be removed from her confinement in the palace dungeons and sentenced to death. I nodded my assent, my face unreadable, as they bowed and left. Later that evening, during a rare quiet moment in the gardens, Princess Solana found me. She was still dressed in the deep emerald gown from the day's announcements, which had declared her the new ruler of our lands. "Leandra," she said softly, her usual warmth tempered by a gravity that matched my own. "I wanted to talk to you before tomorrow." Her face, usually so vibrant, held a rare shadow. She glanced away, her dark eyes studying the barren winter branches that stretched over us like skeletal fingers. "You don't have to say it," I murmured. I knew what she was here to ask, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it aloud. She met my gaze, her expression both fierce and vulnerable. "You're the only one who can do this with mercy." The princess's words tore at my heart. She had grown up under my watchful eye, and over the years, I had come to know her spirit and kindness like no other. And now she was asking me to extinguish the last ember of the old line, the only family she had left in this world. As dawn approached the next day, my brother Aaron stirred me from a light, restless sleep. He was already dressed in his work clothes, his face streaked with dirt from the eastern fields, where he'd been laboring in the bitter cold since the early hours. "Didn't think I'd be the one to wake you today," he teased, though his smile was strained. He knew what awaited me. "Funny," I muttered, dragging myself out of bed, my head heavy with what lay ahead. "Usually, it's you who can't be pulled out of bed before dawn." He gave me a sympathetic smile, squeezing my shoulder in silent support before leading me outside, where my executioner's cloak hung on a wooden hook. It felt heavier than ever as I pulled it over my shoulders. "I'll be waiting here," Aaron murmured. I nodded, grateful for his presence, and made my way toward the castle's dimly lit dungeons alone. Inside, the dungeon was a labyrinth of damp stone walls, illuminated by only a few flickering torches. The guard, Edric, a young man of no more than 20, looked nervously at me as I approached the door to Princess Mirren's cell. "She's already awake," he whispered, almost as if he thought she could hear him through the thick stone walls. I nodded, pressing my hand against the cold iron door. It felt like a seal on a fate that had been decades in the making. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I found her sitting on a rough wooden bench, her posture as straight and dignified as if she were seated on a throne. "Princess Mirren," I greeted her, my voice reverent despite myself. She looked up, a faint smile gracing her lined face. Her hair was a thin cascade of silver that reached her shoulders, her piercing blue eyes unclouded even after years in the dark. "Leandra," she said with calm acceptance, "I've been waiting for you." Her serenity unnerved me. Most prisoners fought, screamed, cried, but Mirren just looked at me with an understanding gaze. "You knew I was coming." "Of course." Her voice held a mixture of weariness and acceptance. "When you've been kept here as long as I have, you learn to read between the silences." There was a strange, aching wisdom in her words, and for a moment, I felt a pang of empathy for this woman, who had once been a young girl, trapped in the dungeon before her life had even truly begun. "Princess," I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Is there anything I can do for you before we leave?" Her eyes softened. "The garden," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "I would like to see the garden." In silence, I led her through the torchlit halls and out into the frosty morning air. The palace garden lay beneath a soft layer of untouched snow, the rose bushes and hedges outlined in frost. Mirren took a few tentative steps, her gaze absorbing the delicate beauty around her, as if she were drinking in her last breath. She knelt by a snow-covered rose, reaching out to touch the icy petals with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'd forgotten how beautiful it all was. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I watched her, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like the winter cold. My grip on my blade tightened. "Is there anything else you wish to say?" She turned to me, her gaze piercing but full of compassion. "Leandra, remember this. Our choices shape us, but we can always choose kindness. Do not let your heart grow cold." Her words lingered as I finished my grim duty. When it was over, I couldn't look at her, afraid that her final words would haunt me. I left her body in the hands of the guards and stumbled back to the palace. I found Princess Solana waiting for me in the garden's entrance. Her face was solemn, and when I approached her, she reached out, her hand warm and steady on my arm. "Thank you, Leandra," she whispered. "I can't imagine what this must have cost you." I met her gaze, trying to find words that could explain the churning storm of emotions within me. The words of Princess Mirren echoed in my mind, her advice to choose kindness, even when it was hardest. "Solana," I whispered, my voice trembling, "would you walk with me?" Her eyes softened and she nodded, her hand slipping into mine. Together, We strolled through the winter garden, our steps slow and measured. For the first time, I looked at Solana not as the princess I served, but as the woman she truly was. The woman I had come to care for in ways I couldn't fully explain. As dawn crested the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I felt the ache within me begin to fade. Solana's hand in mine was a promise of a future that could be different. Perhaps Mirren's legacy wasn't bound to end in that dungeon. Under the morning light, I turned to Solana and whispered, "I don't want to wait anymore." She smiled, her eyes shimmering with unspoken understanding, and together we walked into a new dawn, leaving behind the shadows of the past.